Ja, einen schönen guten Abend. Mein Name ist Michael Kämper-van Boogaart. Ich bin einer der Veranstalter der Mosse-Lecture, and now I switch to broken English. A very welcome to the last of this semester's Mosse-Lecture on Zionism, History, Projects, Objections. We start in May listening to and having a discussion with the historian Stephen E. Ashheim. His lecture highlighted the interaction between concepts of nationalism and the emergence of Zionism. He focused on George Mosse, the patron of our lecture series, and on Mosse's relationship to Zionist politics before and after 1933. How did his humanist nationalism fit with a liberal Zionism? That was one of the historic questions he raised. And what could this critical sympathy mean in the days after October the 7th and Israel's war in Gaza? Mark David Baer, also historian, presented findings from his recent book on Muslim-Jewish relations. In a macro-historical perspective, he differentiated between 5 relational dynamics of those relations or forms of coexistence. Symbiosis, pact of protection, the Jew as ally of the Muslim as the savior of the Jew, and Christian hegemony. And he analyzed the changes in these dynamics that came along with the European 18th century, namely the development of the modern national state and its fragile forms of Jewish integration. Also important, the different positions of Muslims and Jews in the world wars of the 20th century. One topic in our discussion was a question in how far the speaking of coexistence implies a concept that is too humanistic, as it neglects the social distinctions between Jewish and Muslim inhabitants. Thus, our discussion opened a view on further differences inside the Jewish and Muslim population. The third lecture was delivered by the political scientist Bashir Bashir. Bashir illuminated parallels of 2 quite different but connected experiences, the Holocaust and the Nakba. On the basis of this discussion, he strongly argued for political coexistence of Jewish and Palestinian citizens that follows ethical principles of equality, parity, and cohabitation. His talk also considered in which way recent accusations of anti-Semitism are being instrumentalized in order to perpetuate Israel's supremacy. That discussion included critical comments on foreign policies, identifying anti-Semitism and the accusation of Israeli terror attacks in Gaza and West Bank. This controversy surrounding anti-Semitism implies the crucial problem of how to define anti-Semitism. These days will be continued in today's lecture. Our main speaker, Shaul Magid, will ask, why do you Jews find it so difficult to talk about anti-Semitism today? He has let us know that his efforts to answer this question will include a discussion of the concept of eternal anti-Semitism as well as the debate about the uniqueness of the Holocaust in Jewish scholarship as part of the anti-Semitism debate. Related to this debate, he will investigate prominent explanations emphasizing the exceptional status of the State of Israel. As a scholar of Judaic studies, he will concentrate on the challenges of formulating a definition in Jewish discourse, but I'm sure that will reflect German and American language policies too. Our leaflet says our guest, Shaul Magid, is a Judaic scholar and rabbi. Actually, Shaul Magid has been named Professor at Modern Jewish Studies in Residence effective 1st of July 2025 at Harvard University, and is a senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. It does not need saying Harvard University plays its role in disputes where accusations of tolerating anti-Semitic incidents were used to restrict academic freedom. Maybe he will tell us more about the current developments, which he describes in an essay with the title The War Against the University 2024. Shaul Magid is considered one of the foremost scholars of Jewish thought in the US. His works includes many monographs forthcoming, The Scourge of Nationalism, and papers on Hasidism, metaphysics, the Bible, Talmud, and a biography of Mai Kahan. Magid is also well known as a public intellectual, a voice that is present in a lot of journals and online forums. If you want to read more about his personal biography, you can gain insights reading a chapter in his most recent essay collection, The Necessity of Exile, 2023, that I highly recommend. The chapter is called My Tragic Love Affair with Zionism. You might be surprised that Magid came to Judaism via his sympathy for American counterculture. After pursuing an alternative lifestyle in the deserts of New Mexico, he bought a one-way ticket to Israel in 1978. For him, that seemed to be the place where to live his life otherwise. In a kind of hippie environment, he found the link to the Haredi world of Jewish orthodoxy and later to the early settler movement. The romanticism he and his peers followed in Israel and Palestine in those days was confronted by a secular Zionism and its interest in controlling the land. But you should read it on your own, how this mixture of Jewish spiritualism and Bob Marley sounds influenced the young Magid. If you look at the spectrum of essays to be found in the collection of 2023, you will see that it makes sense to include an autobiographical essay. It creates one of the connecting lines between the different thoughts and ideas in Judaic hemisphere. Magid's early reflections refer to the question what kind of Zionism might deliver contemporary orientations. Now, he says, quote, Zionism is essentially, in my view, a chauvinistic ideology at its core, unquote. Instead of reforming or modernizing that kind of ideology, Magid transforms an expression of Hannah Arendt, who characterized Zionism as a kind of counter-ideology, the answer to antisemitism. Now Magid pleads for a policy described as counter-Zionism. Quote, counter-Zionism free from Zionist ideological claims and proprietary principles, free from the intoxication of power, can provide a vision of nationhood that includes and does not simply tolerate ethnic difference. Such a state would not be founded on the notion that this is our land and we'll give you a piece of it on our terms. Rather, it would be predicated on the principle that we live in this land together on equal footing and neither party can claim ownership any more than the other, unquote. And he adds, quote, Netanyahu once said that Israel's pre-1967 borders were the borders of Auschwitz. I do not think Zionism can think its way out of this. So perhaps we should think our way out of Zionism, unquote. It goes without saying that Magid has also discussed diverse forms of anti-Semitism in his last essay collection, and also the strategic instrumentalization of anti-Semitism accusations. As I'm sure that we are going to hear more about this very soon, I limit myself to a quote from a more recent essay titled, Is Western Self-Hatred the Problem in the Gaza War Protest Movement? Quote, it's a sad irony that the state of Israel was founded as a state of the oppressed and has now become a state of the oppressor. As a Jew and as an Israeli citizen, that is painful to me as it is to many of us. But that doesn't make it untrue. History is not a deep pool, is nothing if not a deep pool of irony where the unexpected often becomes the law. It's not anti-Semitic to oppose those who dominate others or to resist those who claim that they are the real victims of those they dominate. 2024. Magid's conversation partner today will be Stefanie Schüler-Springorum. She's a historian, director of the Center for Research on Antisemitism at TU Berlin, and co-director of the Selma Stern Center for Jewish Studies Berlin-Brandenburg. She was and is a member of a couple of advisory boards dealing with history, politics, antisemitism, and Jewish studies. Stefanie Schüler-Springorum was one of the 200 signatories of the highly discussed Jerusalem Declaration on Antisemitism. As speaker of the TU Center, she also signed the Declaration of Initiative gegen 5.3 Weltoffenheit. As you can see, she's deeply involved in debates concerning our topics today. But finally, I should not miss the opportunity to recommend her latest book, Unerwünscht, Die westdeutsche Demokratie und die Verfolgten des NS-Regimes, published this year. She closed the last chapter of this monograph with the sentence, originally in German, of course, "If one no longer understands the treatment of the persecuted of National Socialism merely as according to the history of National Socialism, but finally also integrates it into the history of the Federal Republic, and if one includes the perspective of the persecuted, then this history becomes more inconsistent, contradictory, and short, democratic." I think that the case studies and the historical contextualizations in Unerwünscht contribute successfully to this perspective. And now please join me in welcoming Shaul Magid. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that great introduction. I realize that one of the occupational hazards of writing an autobiographical essay is that someday someone might read it back to you in public. So you should all think about that. It's really an honor to be here. I mean, as I was walking in and looking at the photographs of everyone that taught here, I feel like it was reliving my graduate education in images. So it's really actually a pleasure and an honor to be here and to be in Berlin. The study of anti-Semitism has been a subject of serious scholarly investigation for many decades. Today, it has taken on a new life for a variety of reasons, most importantly, October 7th and the ensuing war in Gaza, and the critical reactions to the war around the world, especially on college campuses in the US and abroad. It's indeed an honor for me to address this topic in Berlin in a lecture honoring George Mosse, one of the great historians of fascism and Nazism. While not a scholar of anti-Semitism per se, Mosse's depiction of Nazism and The Crisis of German Ideology as, quote, an anti-Jewish revolution, contextualized the complex series of events that brought Germany from being the very fountainhead of the Enlightenment to that dark place, what Mosse called, and I quote again, a revolution of the soul where the Jews and the Jewish question was a central issue because the Jew was seen as the enemy. The Jew stood for modernity and destructiveness. That's Mosse. There are those who maintain that such a precarious place continues to this day. For example, not too long ago, in a 2003 book with the title Never Again, Abe Foxman, who is the former chairman of the Anti-Defamation League in the United States, wrote as follows, and I quote, this is 2003. I am convinced that we in America currently face as great a threat to the safety of the Jewish people as the one we faced in the 1930s, if not a greater one. End quote. 2003. I'm not a scholar of anti-Semitism nor a spokesman for any Jewish organization, and thus I make no pretense to know whether such a provocative, even inflammatory assessment is accurate, but I certainly think it merits some serious investigation. But I want to ask a different, albeit related set of questions, not about the rise of anti-Semitism or about its origins, but rather why Jews today in America and elsewhere don't seem to be able to talk about anti-Semitism at all without the conversation quickly devolving into misunderstanding and irreconcilable differences. And by extension, but also related, why do we seemingly become obsessed with defining anti-Semitism, something that is actually quite new in Jewish history? So I want to begin with a somewhat provocative yet also serious question. When did anti-Semitism become a problem? My question intentionally separates the existence and persistence of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism as a problem. On the term anti-Semitism itself, whether, as Hannah Arendt and David Engels suggest, we limit it to the origins in the mid-19th century, or whether we use it as an umbrella term to include anti-Judaism, as David Nierenberg prefers, or Judeophobia, as Peter Schaefer in relation to antiquity prefers, or as Jonathan Judakin relates to that issue of the term anti-Judeophobia in the contemporary world, or simply Judenhass. All of this is not really my interest. I'll use the term anti-Semitism heuristically to make a series of points about the phenomenon of our day, knowing the contested nature of the term. What I mean when I ask, when did anti-Semitism become a problem, is to suggest that before the emancipation of the Jews in Europe over the course of the 19th century, animus toward them existed for a variety of reasons, but I don't think that Jews generally viewed it as a problem that had a solution, but rather as part of the very fabric of what it meant to be a Jew in the world. As Scott Ori shows in his work on Jews of Poland, there were many cases where anti-Semitism forced Jews out of cities and towns, and then after some time, those very same Jews returned to those very same towns and continued with their lives. They may have understood animus against them in a variety of ways. Some viewed it as part of their covenantal exilic paradigm, that exile was a divine punishment that will continue until the restoration of the Jews to the land of Israel, or redemption, or alternatively, hatred by the world as a sign of their intimacy with God. Others may have seen it simply as the consequence of being a fragile minority. I raise these possibilities only to suggest that they didn't see it as a problem that had a solution, but a reality they had to live with and were willing to live with as long as their lives were not in danger. This may have something to do with the concept of progress. In her book on violence, written in 1969, or published in 1969, written as a response to the student protests in 1968, Hannah Arendt writes as follows, and I quote, "The notion that there is such a thing as progress of mankind was unknown prior to the 17th century and became almost universally accepted dogma by the 19th century. Whether Jews viewed anti-Semitism metaphysically or theologically under the auspices of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's famous statement in the Talmud, Esau hates Jacob, or whether they viewed it as a product of Christian supersessionism, perhaps beginning with Augustine after the Christianization of Rome, or in some other way, I'm suggesting that before the 18th century, anti-Semitism was likely received by many Jews simply as a given and not a problem. This changes with the Emancipation, a project that was focused on normalizing the Jew in Europe, including them as part of society, the assumption that being their excluded the assumption that that their excluded status had something to do with the animus against them, perhaps close to Zygmunt Bauman's idea of allocentrism, or that is, the strangeness of the Jews. Ironically, as historians note, it was emancipation that sparked modern anti-Semitism by Wilhelm Marr in his book The Way to Victory of Germanism over Judaism in 1879. Interestingly, Marr's second wife was Jewish, and she died with her child in childbirth. The combination of race science, where the Jew was racialized, and the economic competition Jews presented when they became a more integral part of the economy in an industrialized and urbanizing Europe, that was Herzl's view of anti-Semitism. Marr and others came to believe that the Jews were a threat to flourishing of German society. This soon led a young Viennese journalist, Theodor Herzl, to surmise that emancipation would not succeed in normalizing the Jews and diminish animus against them. Soon afterwards, he posed Zionism as an alternative, a point that I will return to below. My point in all this is to suggest that anti-Semitism becomes a problem only when there is an expectation that it should not exist. Today, when we discuss anti-Semitism, we do so from this perspective. This is not to say there is any expectation that anti-Semitism will cease to exist, but rather that it should not exist. And thus it is viewed as a problem that requires strategy for a solution as much as possible. In this moment, anti-Semitism has again become a central topic of conversation and concern for Jews worldwide, but not quite like before. While the attention may be pointed toward the left's protest over Israel's war on Gaza, the rise of the reactionary right in America and elsewhere, it also illustrates anti-Semitism's continued resilience. Today, however, Jews engage the problem of anti-Semitism from a place of relative safety, the democratic diaspora, and sovereignty, the state of Israel, even as the rise in anti-Semitism has produced palpable and understandable anxiety. In addition, anti-Semitism was traditionally a term that described negative attitudes towards Jews. But today, while retaining that definition, it has also morphed into something more complex, as we see by the media explosion around the New York City mayoral candidate Zoran Mamdani. It is now sometimes used as a weapon by some Jews to chastise other Jews and non-Jews who do not cohere with their understanding of what it means to not hate the Jews, in many cases to support Israel. Or as a weapon of the right, both Jew and non-Jew, to attack the left, often on matters that have nothing to do with Jews. For example, DEI or wokeness or something like that. That is, increasingly today, anti-Semitism is not solely that which marks an attitude toward Jews, but that which defines all who adhere to a particular political perspective. The obsession today with defining anti-Semitism accompanies this new anxiety and yet should also give us pause. What are definitions for? And why the need for a definition of anti-Semitism now? Defining something creates parameters, boundaries, and in some cases is an exercise of control. In these cases, definitions are used to create parameters of truth. As Foucault argued in his essay, Truth and Power, truth is never independent of the power it seeks to yield. One can say the same thing about definitions. So here's a thought experiment. The triad of a maximalist notion of anti-Semitism. To my question, why can't Jews talk about anti-Semitism and why the conversation seems to be obsessed with defining it, I make the following suggestion. Many who hold what I am calling a maximalist view of anti-Semitism in our time are deeply invested in the following three precepts. Number one, the eternality of anti-Semitism. Number two, the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And number three, the Jewish state as exceptional. These three claims are related, even as they also, in some sense, contradict one another. For example, the eternality of the anti-Semitism and the uniqueness of the Holocaust are potentially in tension. If anti-Semitism is eternal, then in what way is the Holocaust unique, outside perhaps of its scale? And if anti-Semitism is animus towards Jews writ large, in what way is criticizing a nation state, even a Jewish nation state, anti-Semitic? While each of these claims requires a nuanced investigation, as a triad, I suggest they have some utility as a thought experiment to better understand why it has appeared so difficult for Jews today to have a constructive conversation about anti-Semitism, and by extension, Israel, and what to do about it. Each one of these precepts is a subject in itself. I only offer a brief excursus on each and then try to suggest why one stands on each of these, where one stands on these three issues. That is, the eternality of anti-Semitism, the uniqueness of the Holocaust, and the exceptionality of the Jewish state will determine how they interpret the Jewish dilemma today. For example, if one holds that anti-Semitism is not eternal, and that the Holocaust is not unique, and that the state of Israel is not exceptional, or any combination thereof, one's position on anti-Semitism and its relationship to Israel will become clearer. So I want to treat each of these claims separately. Anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and the state of Israel, that have often been viewed in relation to one another and sometimes even interdependent. Herzl's The Jewish State was predicated on viewing Jewish political sovereignty as a response to anti-Semitism. Whether Herzl thought anti-Semitism was eternal or not is a more complicated question, although he definitely held that a Jewish state would minimize its deleterious effects. In this sense, anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and Zionism seem inextricably intertwined, and I suggest how we understand the first two will invariably impact how we understand the third, and by extension, how we react to the realities of a post-October 7th Israel, its electoral and military choices, in some cases, by linking October 7th to the Holocaust, even equating Hamas, or now Iran, to the Nazis, which is very common fare in Israel, begs a more careful treatment. So I don't engage this exercise to pose any solutions, but I'm interested in what Hannah Arendt called Verstehen, the fine art of understanding. Eternal anti-Semitism. The premise of my remarks is that anti-Semitism today has come to revolve primarily around questions of Zionism in Israel, and this includes the present project of definitions. For example, most of the points defining anti-Semitism in the IHRA document relate to Israel and Zionism. It is a question that has sparked new layers of discussion and debate, arguably reaching back to 1974 when the term new anti-Semitism was first introduced in the book by Arnold Foster and Bernard Epstein, both who worked for the Anti-Defamation League, in a book called The New Anti-Semitism. The new anti-Semitism implied anti-Semitism in the Muslim world and pointedly anti-Semitism of the New Left and its byproducts in the late 1960s and 1970s. While there's been much writing about this new anti-Semitism in the waning decades of the 20th century, more recently in the new anti-Semitism era, and here I really want to point to Eldad Lapidot's book, Jews Out of the Question, who really gives the most comprehensive and detailed, in my mind, compelling argument about anti-Semitism and what the project really is about. The questions of anti-Semitism have risen to questions of legality, which require more explicit definitional guidelines. Thus, the academic discussion that carried with it nuance, context, and caveats began to clash with the legal discussion, which required firmer boundaries and serve legal ramifications. The first fruits of this turn have yielded the IHRA, the Jerusalem document, and the Nexus document, all proposing to define anti-Semitism for the purposes of legal enforcement, even as the author of the IHRA document, Kenneth Stern, openly stated that his document was not meant to be used as a legal tool, but as a working paper for further discussion. The same is true of JDA, the Jerusalem document, and Nexus. So I want to highlight two salient notions of anti-Semitism in scholarly discourse, simply as a heuristic device to put it in conversation with Holocaust uniqueness and Israel's exceptionality. The eternalist anti-Semitism argument can be divided into two major sections, branches. The first theological and the second I call civilizational. The theological claim is captured in the Talmudic statement Esau hates Jacob, where Esau moves from its Talmudic context, which was Rome or Edom, to include the entire world. In his excellent book, Jacob and Esau, European Jewish History Between Nation and Empire, Duke Professor of Modern European History, Malachi Cohen, argues that Esau hates Jacob does not universalize Esau to refer to all Gentiles towards some theory of eternal anti-Semitism, but largely specific to Rome and Christendom until the late 19th century, and mostly in Yiddish literature. Hakohen argues that the admixture of Yiddish literature and early Zionist writing transformed this trope to serve as a textual and even maybe a legal, Jewish legal, halachic basis for eternal anti-Semitism. The eternality argument also has an important non-theological iteration. I would call it civilizational, perhaps made popular by Robert Wisrich's book, Anti-Semitism, The Longest Hatred, in 1991, and his 2010 book, A Lethal Obsession, Anti-Semitism from Antiquity to the Global Jihad. Wistrich bases his analysis on what he calls the sui generis nature of anti-Semitism in relation to other forms of hatred. Sui generis here denotes uniqueness, but not necessarily eternality, even as the former can sometimes collapse into the latter. And of course, historians generally do not like categories such as sui generis or uniqueness, which led some to think that Wistrich's project was too ideologically driven and unconvincing historically or theologically, and it's not really taken that seriously in the academic world, but his argument remains very popular outside the academy. If we view anti-Semitism historically, that is contextually, as Hannah Arendt, Gavin Langmuir, David Engel, Jonathan Judakin, and many others argue, then the question of its eternality, that is its ahistoricity, and its sui generis nature cannot easily be sustained. An interesting example here is Nuremberg's widely read Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition in 2013. Nuremberg traces various forms of what he calls anti-Judaism, and he specifically calls it anti-Judaism and not anti-Semitism. Throughout the history of the West, he actually goes back, he has a chapter on ancient Egypt, which is a whole other story I'm not going to get into. Throughout the history of the West, without overtly making an eternalist anti-Semitism argument, although many have read Nuremberg as historical proof of what Arendt critically called the unhistorical claim of eternal anti-Semitism. In fact, Nuremberg writes in his introduction, and I quote him, "The third methodological deviation of this book is the 3,000-year sweep of this history, which may wrongly suggest to some readers either that I take ideas to be eternal or unchanging, or that I am engaged in a genealogy and evolutionary history, a question for the origin of the species." That's the end of Nuremberg. That is, Nuremberg is doing precisely not what Robert Wisrich is doing. But he's often mistakenly read to be doing exactly the same thing. So, what are the critiques of the eternal anti-Semitism? One of the salient critiques of eternal anti-Semitism was Hannah Arendt, both in her 1951 The Origins of Totalitarianism and then her unfinished essay from the 1930s entitled Anti-Semitism. Her argument is quite complex, and I don't really have time to go into it, but I really want to highlight a few points. Her basic claim is that the eternalist argument is by definition unhistorical, as all eternalist arguments are, because it, quote, naturalizes Jewish hate, and in effect exonerates both perpetrator and victim. If anti-Semitism is eternal, whether it's metaphysical or theological or civilizational, the victims, that is the Jews, are always blameless, and the perpetrators, that is the anti-Semites, are always responsible. But how can one be fully responsible for something that is eternal or natural and thus beyond their control? And if anti-Semitism is eternal, there is no way to solve it, only to control it. Arendt understands anti-Semitism as a modern phenomenon from a historical perspective, claiming that it emerges from the European nation-state combined with what she says, and I'm quoting her here, certain aspects of Jewish history and especially in Jewish functions during the last centuries. In her reading, anti-Semites are responsible for their anti-Semitism, and Jews may also not totally be innocent of behaviors that could exacerbate negative reactions against them, because she argues that is how human societies work. Actors with agency all contribute to historical realities. She's certainly not blaming the victim here, but simply arguing that anti-Semitism as a historical phenomenon, all actors play a role. And one job of this historian is to interrogate the roles of each in any historical moment. Another view, Kenneth Marcus's book, The Definition of Anti-Semitism, which Jonathan Judakin calls cyclical eternalism, suggests that anti-Semitism isn't everywhere and always, closer to Wisrich, but It moves in cycles contingent on historical circumstances. In some way, Marcus is trying to split the difference between someone like Wistrich and Arendt, but in my view, he never breaks the eternality circle, and is thus never open to the possibility of human responsibility, either of the perpetrator or the victim. For example, Marcus holds the position, very common in certain circles today, it was actually popularized by the Canadian politician Irwin Cutler, that Israel today is the collective Jew. To argue that therefore anti-Zionism is really just a guise for anti-Semitism, since the state has become itself the Jew. But of course, this is an unhistorical claim, a weaponized claim at worst. How could one historically substantiate such a claim? And what does it mean for a nation state where only half the Jews live to function under the assumption that the world is always by definition against it? How can such a state be part of a global community of states under those premises? For one who believes in eternal anti-Semitism, even cyclical eternalism, none of that is necessary. Instead of normalizing the Jews through the establishment of a nation state, the eternalist view, in whatever form, arguably deepens the Jews' collective abnormality, now giving it a political dimension. The problem with the eternalist argument as applied to Zionism is that, as Arendt argued, for eternalists, the victim is always innocent almost by definition, which in cases where Jews were subject to imperial or state power is less problematic, but in the case of a nation state, it arguably exonerates all behavior of that state as a legitimate form of defense against anti-Semitism. This is because in the eternalist paradigm of anti-Semitism, the Jews, now the state, is always the victim. Thus, it is common fare to hear that Israel is in a perennial existential crisis. Do any other states define themselves as in a perennial existential crisis? I'm not making this claim polemically, but trying to create a definitional map of the ways scholars understand what we mean when we attempt to define anti-Semitism. So what I'm suggesting here is that the extent to which Zionism is built on the foundations of anti-Semitism, or as a solution to anti-Semitism, the eternalist argument is either openly or tacitly adopted to deflect critique of that nation state from accusations of bad actions toward others. For me, the more difficult case is not one of the overt eternalists, someone like some theological eternalism, but rather the covert eternalists. That is, those who claim that anti-Semitism may not be eternal, but tacitly they act as if it is. The Holocaust's uniqueness. This question about the Holocaust's uniqueness has been at the center of Holocaust studies for over half a century. Was the Holocaust a unique event in Jewish or world history? And in many ways, it underlies post-Holocaust theology initiated by Richard Rubinstein in his book After Auschwitz in 1966, and then myriad studies by people like Emil Fackenheim, Eliezer Berkowitz, Irving Yitz Greenberg, Stephen Katz, Yehuda Bear, Robert Wistrich, and others. My interests here are quite narrow, though, and they focus on the general discussion of uniqueness regarding the Holocaust and the way it informs how people understand the relationship between anti-Semitism, Zionism, and the State of Israel. The link between the Holocaust and the State of Israel is itself a matter of robust debate. On the one hand, there are those who justify the state because of the Holocaust, those who think the Holocaust was a theological precursor to the state, and those who think that there is no theological religious connection between the Holocaust and the State of Israel, people like theologian David Novak and Yeshayahu Leibovich. Intense focus on the Holocaust as a lens to view developments in Jewish identity and Jews' relationship to Israel begins really in the 1970s. The question regarding the Holocaust's uniqueness was a prominent part of the post-Holocaust theorizing, an expression of competing desires of Jews, American Jews, to be fully integrated and yet definitely distinct from American society. And it remains so today. So the term uniqueness, like sui generis, is generally a problematic term from an analytical perspective. For example, Peter Novick remarks, and I'm quoting him, insistence on the Holocaust's uniqueness, or the denial of its uniqueness, is an intellectually empty enterprise for reasons having nothing to do with the Holocaust and everything to do with uniqueness. A moment's reflection makes clear that the notion of uniqueness is simply vacuous. This is what Novak says. Uniqueness seems to be largely a placeholder for other meanings that are in play when those positions are debated or identified. Uniqueness advocates from the 70s to the present present maybe more interested in what the term produces rather than its conceptual coherence. Theologically, uniqueness refers to an event that could not fit into any theological paradigm and thus unanswerable with traditional theories of theodicy. As Rubinstein argues in After Auschwitz, uniqueness would require a radical revision of the Jewish covenant, which is why many ultra-Orthodox Jews reject the uniqueness argument and explains why many ultra-Orthodox Jews were opposed to establishing an annual Holocaust Day of Remembrance. They believe that the Holocaust should be remembered within the context of other Jewish atrocities throughout history. There's something quite theologically radical in the establishment of a Holocaust Memorial Day. Historically, uniqueness is much more polemical and it seems divided among ideological camps. For example, if the Holocaust as a genocide against the Jews is unique and thus an exceptional case in Jewish history or human history, perhaps the case of the Jews after the Holocaust, that is, Israel, can justifiably inherit a similar, unique, and thus exceptional status, which is what uniqueness might imply when morphed into a political register. So therefore, again, the Zionist project is not about becoming, as what became the Zionist mandate, like all the other nations, but different than all the other nations. How might this impact how one views the war on Gaza, for example? The uniqueness claim presents certain challenges to the historian. One problem is that to argue for uniqueness lends itself to taking an event outside of the realm of history, making it what Jewish theologian Arthur Cohen called a mysterium tremendum, that in many cases results in the mystification of a historical event. This is close to Arendt's problem with eternal anti-Semitism. Mystification too easily relegates the Holocaust to a purely religious and not historical moment. And if we link the Holocaust as an inextricably ahistorical event to the very historical nation state called Israel, it is too easy, although not necessarily, to import the ahistoricity to a nation state. Yet even given this challenge, many historians argue that the Holocaust is in fact a unique event in both Jewish and general history. In doing so, the historian must defend how something can be both a novum and historical at the same time. And by extension, given its connection to Israel, how Israel can be both a novum and historical at the same time. For example, Holocaust historian Yehuda Bauer maintains that the Holocaust is a historical novum and simultaneously warns against using the Holocaust's uniqueness towards any kind of mystification. He writes, this is a quote, "It is necessary to dispel mystification around the Holocaust if only to clear the way for the historical perspective," end quote. While Bauer comes down on the side of uniqueness, he remains acutely aware of the way uniqueness can produce a mystification that works against what many Holocaust scholars want, which is the memory of the event in history to remain. As a historian, Bauer knows that. And he writes, "The inevitable conclusion must be that if we label the Holocaust as inexplicable, it becomes relevant to lamentations and liturgy, but not to historical analysis." End quote. Uniqueness elides history, and this will lead to mystification, which, according to Bauer, will ultimately result in forgetting. The fear of repetition is arguably still the emotional engine that drives much of the discourse about the Holocaust today in Israel, as Derek Pensla recently argued in his book, Israel: An Emotional State. There are those who argue that while the Holocaust as a historical event ended in 1945, it remains a meta-historical phenomenon, as a mysterium tremendum, perhaps captured by Abe Foxman's quote at the beginning in 2003 to say that the situation of the Jews in America in 2003 is the same or worse than the situation of Jews in Germany in 1939. In this view, contemporary anti-Semitism in Europe and now in the Muslim world is an extension of anti-Semitism that produced the Holocaust on this logic. We can see this the way Holocaust analogies emerged a few days after October 7th, even though October 7th occurred under Israeli Jewish sovereignty and the Holocaust occurred while the Jews were in a powerless state living under the sovereignty of others. Without some variation on the view of something being unique and historical, that is, it can occur again, it is difficult to hold the Holocaust's uniqueness and its possible repetition simultaneously. That is, to argue today about an impending Holocaust while maintaining the Holocaust as a unique event in human history may be implying, intentionally or not, that the first Holocaust never really ended. And I think that was what is implied in Foxman's comment in 2003. This is not such a far-fetched position among many who defend Israel's exceptionalism, as we'll see in a moment. So what I want to suggest here is that the conversations about anti-Semitism or Israel today often break down in families, synagogues, communities, and campuses if we would take account of how the parties think about the claim of the Holocaust uniqueness. We might find those differences have an impact on the issues of the day. To rehearse what I stated at the outset, if you believe that the Holocaust was a unique event and that the Holocaust is part of history, and thus can be repeated, and you think there's a strong link, whether it's historical, political, theological, between the Holocaust and the state of Israel, then you can easily posit Israel as an exceptionalist state that not only should not, but cannot be held by the standards of other states. The problem with this, of course, is that by making Israel an exception, it feeds right into the double standard argument, which is often deemed anti-Semitic, albeit in this case in reverse. There are numerous ways to parse this. First, to deny the Holocaust as unique and see it as perhaps the most horrific event in known history, but not categorically ahistorical. Second, to maintain that the Holocaust is unique, but claim that it has no religious meaning in relation to the state of Israel. Or third, to claim the Holocaust is unique and thus in some way may have never fully ended, contemporary anti-Semitism being an extension of the Holocaust, thus calling Hamas Nazis, for example, thereby extending the exceptionality of the Holocaust to the political and historical reality of a nation-state. Each of these yields something different regarding how one understands Israel as a nation among nations, or alternatively, as Scripture describes it in the book of Numbers through the mouth of Bilam, a people that dwells alone. It speaks to Israel's responsibilities as a sovereign state and the way it views its enemies. For example, if one accepts the view that Israel today is the collective Jew, then the nation state is not a normal state. That was the very raison d'etre of Zionism, to be like all the nations, but an exceptional one, and thus abnormal, that need not abide by the rules of other nation states. I claim here that, not dissimilar from the question of eternal anti-Semitism, the Holocaust uniqueness question can help us better understand why it's so difficult for Jews to talk about anti-Semitism. So in the final part, I want to address the question of the exceptional nature of the state of Israel and its supporters. Is Israel an exceptional state? At the outset of this talk, I asked the question, why do Jews seem to have such a hard time talking about anti-Semitism? And I suggested that the breakdown of the conversation may be a result of multiple factors, including the misalignment of various premises that make the conversation difficult. I articulated three premises that merited exploration: a disbelief in eternal anti-Semitism, the belief or disbelief in the uniqueness of the Holocaust, and the belief or disbelief in Israel as an exceptional state. So here I want to address the question of Israel as an exceptional state within the context of this larger frame, and the implication that denying that exceptionalism, simply denying the exceptionalism, pushes one closer to the accusation of being called an anti-Semite. One's understanding of the nature of the state of Israel will determine how one supports or criticizes it. This, in part, depends on how one defines the relationship between the state, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. Briefly put, if anti-Semitism is eternal and the Holocaust is unique and the relationship between those two and the state is unassailable, one can easily conclude that the state of Israel is in fact exceptional, and that structural criticism of that state is an expression of anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism and the Holocaust is admittedly a strange way to formulate Israel exceptionalism. Exceptionalism as a concept, as a construct, is very often framed more positively. For example, in the American case of exceptionalism, founded in its aspiration of a liberal democracy, albeit initially just for white people. This has its roots long before the founding of America. Some point to its roots in a speech given by Puritan John Winthrop called A Model of Christian Charity in March 1630 to a group of British subjects embarking on a voyage to Massachusetts Bay Colony. Citing Matthew 5:14, a city on a hill cannot be hid, Winthrop envisioned this new nation as unlike any other nation in its benevolence, its compassion, and its Christian values. A second source is Alex de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Recording the tour that he took of North America, de Tocqueville waxed eloquently on the riches and what he considered the unique potential of this new nation, calling America, quote, quite exceptional. And the Congregationalist theologian Jonathan Edwards, the 18th century, sermonized in New England about America as a paragon of the new millennium. And I have to mention Hegel here because he taught here. Hegel deemed America, quote, the land of the future. American exceptionalism did not sink into partisan politics. Ronald Reagan gave his exceptionalism a new twist by adopting Winthrop's city on the hill metaphor. George W. Bush and Barack Obama referred to American exceptionalism as an uncontested maxim. Of course, the stain of slavery did not go unnoticed in the American exceptional ideal, as coined by Malcolm X when he famously said, "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us." So I briefly visit this American claim of exceptionalism because it is also an important connection between American exceptionalism and Israeli exceptionalism, as documented in Amy Kaplan's excellent book called Our American Israel, which is a fascinating study of how Israel was envisioned in the early colonies in America. Or I should say, the land of Israel. The question of Israeli exceptionalism is an outgrowth and a complicated one between the positive prophetic notion of Israel as a light unto the nations. We see it in Isaiah twice and in Isaiah once. And the negative exceptionalism born from anti-Semitism, reaching its apex in the Holocaust. Speaking about the question of uniqueness regarding the Holocaust, Jewish historian and retired chancellor of Jewish Theological Seminary, Ismar Shorish, wrote as follows, and I quote from an article in Midstream in 1981, "Unique is a description that responsible historians tend to employ only in a very restricted context. Used indiscriminately, it is a throwback to an age of religious polemics where commitment was largely a function of uniqueness. Unfortunately, our obsession with the uniqueness of the Holocaust smacks of a distasteful secular version of chosenness. We are still special, but only by virtue of Hitler's paranoia." That's Shorish. Shorish's point, as I understand it, is that the question of uniqueness, and here I would extend this to exceptionalism regarding the Holocaust, but also it extends to the state of Israel, is a precarious one. First, because uniqueness is a kind of secularization of a theological precept of divine election. That precept can positively be articulated in Israel, at the people Israel, as a light unto the nations. And negatively, and this seems to be Shorish's point, in anti-Semitism captured in the rabbinic dictum, Esau hates Jacob. This distasteful secular version of chosenness, Shorish refers to, I would suggest, as a pillar of the notion of Israel's exceptionalism in a non-theological register. But before getting there, a few words on the positive notion of exceptionalism in Isaiah's "a light unto the nations." It's very interesting, that phrase, "a light unto the nations," which anyone who knows the Hebrew Bible knows that that's a very important phrase. This is a phrase that early Zionists rejected outright. They didn't want to see themselves as being a light unto the nations. They wanted to see themselves as being like all the other nations. And it's only in the 1950s that David Ben-Gurion begins to use that term, although, as we'll see in a moment, Rabbi Kook, in his eulogy to Theodor Herzl in 1984, does use the term, but he's a religious thinker. The secular Zionists did not prefer the term a light unto the nations. So before moving to the challenges of the state around this, it's important to note that today's discussion about the definition of anti-Semitism largely revolves around Israel, as I said, regarding the IHRA document. And another example, which I find quite curious, or I should say disturbing, in their calculation of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, the Anti-Defamation League defines as anti-Semitic any anti-Gaza war protest, peaceful or otherwise, and most of them were peaceful, suggesting that protesting Israel's war on Gaza is by definition an exercise in anti-Zionism, and thus by definition an exercise in anti-Semitism. This has resulted in the expansion of anti-Semitism, with its very focus being the criticism of Israel. So below, I want to suggest that this move helps solidify Israel's exceptionalism as an extension of anti-Semitism, but there's another kind of Zionist exceptionalism that needs some attention. It's often overlooked today the extent to which Zionism was called by its architects a revolution. By revolution, I mean an upending of previous notions of Jewish covenant, including theological precepts and values and collective sensibilities. There's a recent book by Yaakov Yadgar, who teaches at Oxford, called To Be a Jewish State, where he makes the argument that Zionism is a form of supersessionism, internal supersessionism within Judaism. Relevant to our concerns is the prophetic call of Israel's theological exceptionalism in this notion of a light unto the nations, which surprisingly was not often used in medieval and rabbinic sources. It's used and it's cited, but it's not really central. This changed in the wake of the emancipation and the development of the Jews, and the development that the Jews in Europe had a mission in that modernity enabled them to undertake. Terms like ethical monotheism and Jewish values, and later terms like tikkun olam began to appear. So one early example of a use of this is in Rabbi Kook's 1904 eulogy for Herzl, where Kook writes, Israel developed, this is in 1904, long before the state. Israel develops these two forces, the force to see the good of the nation in its physicality, that seeks the strength of its material state, which is the proper basis for the great position Israel finds itself in, to be a holy nation to God, to be one nation in the land, to be a light unto the nations. That is what Kook says in his eulogy for Herzl. For Kook, the instantiation of Israel as a light unto the nations can only come about through the manifestation of its spiritual force through its physical existence. But this sentiment was not shared by many Zionists of his time. One of the more salient aspects of Zionism as a national movement was the desire for Jews to abandon their abnormal status and become a normal people, to be like all the other nations, which is exactly what the Israelites asked Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 8, in asking for a king. As a result, many early Zionists, such as Joseph Chaim Brenner and Baruch Katznelson, rejected the notion of a light unto the nations, viewing it as a false exceptionalism that Zionists needed to abandon, precisely because the term, even in a positive appellation, relegated Jews to abnormal status. In other words, Zionism did not have a universal mission, but was a project of national normalcy alone. Others believed that Isaiah's vision was still operative, which embraced a moral nationalism that did not counter the Zionist project, people like Martin Buber and other binationalists. But that was not the dominant view then, and it is certainly not the dominant view now. While this idea of a light unto the nations became more popular in recent decades, not without criticism, present circumstances have arguably shifted that sentiment to a more survivalist mode, where Israel describes itself as in a state of a perennial existential crisis, whereby the ethical exceptionalism Isaiah has been replaced by, to borrow Shorish's locution, a negative exceptionalism of anti-Semitism. That is, to use the ADL director Jonathan Greenback's locution, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, full stop. That's a quote. If eternal anti-Semitism and the uniqueness of the Holocaust presents the Jews as negatively exceptional, the aspiration of normalcy is thus undermined not because of the lack of national existence, but because it maintains a national existence unlike all other nations. Ironically, one of the precepts of anti-Semitism, according to the IHRA document, is treating Israel with a double standard. Arguably, this negative exceptionalism, founded on the unique quality of Israel's exceptional existential crisis, could possibly constitute a double standard in reverse. When opposition to a state is founded on the notion that a state represents a people who have been uniquely oppressed, that is, the Holocaust, the discussion about anti-Semitism enters a complexity that makes it almost impossible to talk about it among those who do not share those basic precepts. The eternality of anti-Semitism feeds into the uniqueness of the Holocaust that feeds into Israeli exceptionalism. So to conclude, one can see this in real time. By making analogies between October 7th and the Holocaust, or comparisons of Hamas or the Iranian regime to the biblical Amalek, the biblical enemy of Israel for which the Bible commands genocide, and whose genealogy the later tradition claimed was lost, the Jewish state enters into an exceptionalist paradigm that has a significant impact on how Jews can talk about it and anti-Semitism. When a murderous attack on civilians in a sovereign nation state, October 7th, is likened to a systemic genocide of civilians living without the power to defend themselves, the Holocaust, and contesting that analogy may itself result in an accusation of anti-Semitism, the important and complex discussion of anti-Semitism becomes mired such that a rational discussion about it may be difficult, if not impossible, to have. This is why, aside from the realities of realpolitik and the debates about accurate reporting, there is something fundamental going on in terms of why anti-Semitism has now become a central focus of global politics and why Jews can't seem to talk about it in any constructive way. I've argued that eternal anti-Semitism, Holocaust uniqueness, and Israeli exceptionalism are intertwined and implicated with one another in such a way that any conversation about the present realities requires agreement on these three precepts, without which the conversation quickly dissolves into rancor and unpleasantries. These are indeed complicated times. Making them seem easily decipherable may be, in fact, the greatest hazard of this moment. Thank you.
Yeah, I decided to stand up. I think you can hear me better and I can see you. But first of all, I'm looking at you. Thank you so much, Shaul, for your extraordinary lecture in, yes, very, very complicated times. And I think the room and the many people here testify to this. But on the other hand, when I first read the subtitle of your lecture, Why Do Jews Find It So Difficult to Talk About Anti-Semitism Today, I almost laughed. And I thought, well, welcome to Germany then. Things are much worse here, or at least much, maybe more difficult. Even though we seem to be talking about anti-Semitism all the time in this country and in the US as well. But I will try not to fall into the trap of highlighting German exceptionalism and instead concentrate on your illuminating arguments. And I think this is important for another reason that you might not be aware of. It might sound also surprising to the audience that not only the public debate on anti-Semitism in this country here, but also the scholarly one, has been rather disconnected from the international state of art, at least in the last years. While books like the ones that you mentioned by Bob Wistrich and David Nirenberg did receive some attention here in Germany during the last years, but all the efforts of the last decade, maybe, of opening up the specter in the research on anti-Semitism have passed rather unnoticed here. I'm referring here not only to David Engel that you mentioned, to his radical deconstruction of the term anti-Semitism, but also of the American Historical Review Roundtable issue on anti-Semitism edited by Jonathan Judaikin, or the edited book called Key Concepts of Anti-Semitism that, among others, Scott Urey edited, and also the special issue of the Hebrew journal Zion on anti-Semitism that recently has been published in English as well. It's in a language that most of the people here could read as well. I'm mentioning this because I think it's worth mentioning in the first place, this detachment, and also because my response now here is based on engagement with these publications. So what can we do about all this? With all this, the difficulties of talking about anti-Semitism and that you pointed out to us right now. And I think maybe the first and most, the quick answer would be to shy away from binaries. And I think terms like eternal, unique, exceptional exclude per se any discussion about content, any strive at comparison. In fact, any solution that precluded then the precluded one, as you have just shown, very convincingly. But instead of repeating from what you have just said in my own words, I would like to talk about the possibilities to open up these discussions by focusing on the in-between, on a way of thinking that colloquially we tend to call yes, but. Yes, eternal but. Yes, unique but. Yes, exceptional but. And where the but is a point at the moment, or that points out especially to entanglements, to possible entanglements with other historical developments. It's historizing, we would call it. Or to put it very bluntly, I will try to contextualize some points at stake without losing sight of some longue durée or bigger picture. So let's have a look at the eternal anti-Semitism and the historical moment when it became, as you said, a political problem. That is, a time of enlightenment and emancipation. I think you really have an important point here to say this is a change, that it became from a day-to-day experience into a political problem. And I think the most important difference here is maybe not so much like race science or social and economic role of the Jews, as Hannah Arendt put to the fore, but rather the new idea of equality. If we are all equal, how to legitimize that some are less equal than others? And it's not by chance that it was exactly around 1800 that the difference of Jews suddenly became the topic of a vast amount of publications, only to be topped, by the way, by those published on the difference of women. And interestingly, it's from then on that the anti-Jewish resentment becomes highly gendered, entangled, encompassing misogynist and then homophobic images, as George Mosse has already shown half a century ago. So apparently here 2 or 3 exclusionary discourses of modernity merge in order to radicalize one another, and we would have to add xenophobic racism to the picture. For our topic now, this would be the image of the Ostjude. And they do so, they merge and radicalize in times, which is, I think, even more important, they do so in times of growing democratic movements, which for the Jews living in these democracies meant that their fate suddenly depended on the will of a majority and not of kings or popes. And I think it is here that anti-Semitism starts to be used as a political weapon or a cultural code, as Schuler-Volkow once put it, and in that sense sometimes was even removed from its original object, the Jews. Only when in 1933 a political party came to power in Germany that had positioned anti-Semitism at the core of its political project, these different trends of modernity merged and produced the greatest danger ever to Jewish existence in Europe. We all know that the question of uniqueness is one that would need another 2 hours now, but I think it helps to realize, just to start with one idea, it helps to realize that the term Holocaust in itself contains a variety of very different historical events or phenomena, which, and I think it's important to be aware of this as well, be aware of it because it tends to be forgotten. All this developed and radicalized over time. There's not one Holocaust which is like a brick, but it's a development of several events that can be distinguished. And of course, as I said, anti-Semitism stands at the core of the Nazi ideology. But as far as the Nazi vision of a new society was concerned, other groups were destined to vanish as well, albeit they did not have the central function within Nazi world vision. I mean, those, and we know it refers to Sinti, Roma, and the mentally and physically disabled. Second, and the other important argument for uniqueness is always the absence of any rationality within the German genocidal endeavor, especially in times of war. It's this argument saying, why killing people that could be used for workforce? Why destroying one's own needs in times of war? And again, this argument is true, but only partly true. Every Jew and Jewish was destined to be killed, but some were spared in order to work, which is why some survived. And this, again, at least, is not that far away from the way the so-called Slavic people were to be treated according to the Generalplan Ost, the general plan for the East. There it stated 1/3 was supposed to be killed immediately, 1/3 by work and starving, and 1/3 should survive and live as slaves. The German war effort and politics, with this in mind, produced between 12 to 19 million civilian victims in Eastern Europe, which includes the Jewish population in this region. So when we look at the historical reality on the ground, there still remain two important unique elements, I would say, of the German mass murder of European Jewry: the Jewish position within the Nazi ideology and the construction of places designed only for the killing of human beings. Other elements, however, resemble other genocides: massacres and mass shootings, ghettoizations, deportations and mass expulsions, looting, raping, and starving. Most of them happen on other continents. And even though one could and has argued that the distance to those other victims on other continents might have to do with the little belittled meaning we bestow upon their suffering, I would even concede that it's probably normal human behavior to center memory and even research first and foremost on one's own history as victims, as perpetrators, or as Europeans. But I think it's also perfectly possible from that perspective to search for entanglements, for similarities and differences without creating hierarchies, which by chance happen to be the political hierarchies between the West and the rest. This leads me to the third point, to Israel. And here I think our movement has to be more about disentanglement than entanglement. And I'm really grateful, Shaul, to your really clear distinctions between anti-Semitism as hatred towards individuals composing a minority collective in a nation state and hatred towards a nation state. I think that this is crucial for our understanding of the present moment. And it does not, of course, exclude the fact that the latter hatred can be infused by the former, and in the German case, by the need to find some kind of exculpation. But we should not turn the burden of proof around in these cases. Instead, we should try, as Dandina has suggested, to think about Israel as if there were no anti-Semitism, and to think about anti-Semitism as if there was no Israel. In other words, again, it's complicated, and it needs the ability and the will to think dialectically. This, however, is exactly the contrary to what definitions are for. And I would like to end with some remarks on the first line of your title on the obsession with defining anti-Semitism, that is, to find easy answers to complicated realities. But since these easy answers at the same time serve legal aims and repressive means of fighting what is defined as anti-Semitism, we should maybe stop for a minute and think about what we really want. And with we, I'm talking now in Germany here. Of course, we all wish for a better future that includes less hatred, less violence, and less oppression. But lately, the discourse of anti-Semitism and also anti-racism, anti-sexism, etc., pp., has taken on, I would call it, visions of purity, of eternal erasure or permanent security that simply have nothing whatsoever to do with historical, social, or political realities, let alone theories. On the contrary, I think those visions of purity are extremely frightening. And I think that we can and should do better. Thank you.
Now you can hear me. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. I think you kind of brought out part of what I was trying to say, which is the way in which the term itself, the term anti-Semitism itself, has become so broad and widely used that it almost, in some weird kind of sense, loses its meaning. And I think maybe we should just open it up to the floor for questions and conversation.
So my 5-year-old son recently learned how to sing in April during Pesach, Ela shebechol dor vador omdim aleinu lechalotenu. This is something that Jews sing in Passover every year. For in every generation they come upon us to destroy us, to exterminate us. This is something so inherent to the Jewish experience that even my 5-year-old son has learned now to sing it. Which gave me pause for a little while. And I was thinking about that as you were talking about this question of both whether the Holocaust as sui generis or eternal, and whether this hate of Judaism is eternal or non-eternal. Is there something new about the current anti-Semitism as anti-Israelism, or is it all a part of the same continuum? This also made me think, you ask about thinking about the Holocaust and setting up a Holocaust Memorial Day as something that makes it unique. But we also have a day in Judaism remembering the Exodus so many, many years ago. We have a day in Judaism which we celebrate as a holiday about Hanukkah, about every single, or not every single, but of major events of trying to exterminate us, of all our traumatic experiences, are in a way commemorated. It's part of the inherently Jewish experience that we share and that we pass on to our children even as they are so young. Another question on this continuum is how this is informed by one another, the anti-Semitism. So I have had the experience of having somebody argue against Zionism and against the state of Israel using nothing less than the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as proof of his remarks. So this makes me think there is some, that has nothing to do with Israel and its policies, but of something that came before the state of Israel as a nation state, of a conspiracy theory. So there is something that transcends Zionism in this anti-Semitism, and that kind of brings it back from this great kind of academic debate to the lived experiences on the street of people dealing with anti-Semitism today, which is a lot of this anti-Zionism is in fact anti-Semitism. It is rooted in very deeply anti-Jewish things that have nothing to do with the state of Israel or its policy. It is another excuse, as in the past, anti-Semitism was excused by viewing the Jews as complicit in other political ideologies. They were both the capitalists and the communists and so on. And there is some sort of extension of that. Is it eternal? I don't know, but it does lay somewhere on this continuum on this cycle, and that is the lived experience of both the Jews and how they perceive themselves from as little and as young as 5 years old, and what they see on the street.
Right. Thank you for that. So there are a few points here. I'll briefly relate to each one of them. So the problem with with son or daughter, I don't know, but son. The problem with your son is that, or at least the way your son has no problems. The problem is that your son didn't learn the last part of that comment, because it says in every generation, every generation, the nations will rise up to destroy us, and God will save us. That's the whole point of the Haggadah, is that, and God will save us. So in some strange way, the Haggadah is actually a quite anti-Zionist document, because the Zionists are saying, we're going to save ourselves. That's the whole point. It's agency. It's like, we're not going to wait for God. And the Haggadah is saying, no, yes, every generation they'll rise up against you, and because you're in a covenant with me, God will save us. Now, maybe the Holocaust was this point where it became impossible to believe that anymore in some way. Or that in some sense, I think that Zionism is a rebellion against that, and God will save us. So I think that it's important to see the full picture of it, because in the Haggadah, you don't, in the Passover Haggadah, you have no notion of Jewish or Israelite liberation through Israelite agency. It's all God. The whole point of the story is that God is the one that's taking them out of Egypt. And if you look at some like more contemporary Haggadot that were written in Eastern Europe, or that were written in Russia, or the Haggadah of the Communist Party, or the Bund, or other things, you see the way they change it, and it actually is the Jews saving themselves, so that they understood what the Haggadah was saying, and then they subverted it, because they said, we're not going to wait for God to save us anymore. We're going to do it ourselves. So I really do think, in a way, the point of that statement was not necessarily a statement of eternal anti-Semitism, but a statement of, you, Israel, are in a covenant with me, and if you keep up your part of the covenant, I will keep up my part of the covenant. And part of that covenant is that I will save you. Now, again, it could be that the historical realities made that impossible for people to believe it anymore. But I think that's an important point to make. In terms of the Holocaust Memorial Day, it's very interesting because, yes, of course, the Exodus of Egypt, that's biblical. Hanukkah comes a little bit closer, but still within the canonical tradition. Holocaust Memorial Day is the first secular Jewish holiday. It is a secular Jewish holiday. It's established. Now, you could say Israel Independence Day, but Israel Independence Day is really about a nation state. It's not about the Jews. The Holocaust Memorial Day is a secular Jewish holiday that exists outside of the orbit of tradition, even though it might have, you might understand it theologically. And I think this is what the ultra-Orthodox community was uncomfortable with, because they were saying, in a sense, there is nothing within Jewish covenantal history that is unique. Things can be really bad. 1391 pogroms, the pogroms in Kishinev, the expulsion from Spain, but all of those things exist within a covenantal orbit. And they were afraid that if you take the Holocaust out of that covenantal orbit and secularize Jewish tragedy, you're in a sense making the claim that it is not part of Jewish history. It's somehow separate. So those ultra-Orthodox communities, it's not that they say we shouldn't commemorate the Holocaust. They write liturgical poems about the Holocaust that they recite on Tisha B'Av, or the other days where the Mishnah itself says, on this day, we commemorate all of the horrors that happened to the Jewish people. And so there's a kind of radicalism in the Holocaust Memorial Day. I mean, I think now the ultra-Orthodox community has probably acquiesced and commemorated in some way. But I think they saw there was a theological breach, and that was the problem. In terms of the eternal, all of the cases of, I would say it a little bit differently than you. I would say that, I would say two things. One of the things that, I don't know if this is true in Germany, but it is very true in America. What American Jews have a very hard time getting their heads around are those who are, non-Jews, those who are very pro-Israel and anti-Semitic. Right. In other words, that certain evangelical dispensationalist Christians are extremely pro-Israel and also anti-Semitic. And it's something that it's like it's a twist, right? They can't quite get their head around the fact that that according to some of these evangelical dispensationalists, the Jews are a tool for the coming of Christ, return of Christ, and then the book of Revelation allows them the opportunity to convert, and if they don't, the earth opens up and swallows them all. So it doesn't end well for the Jews. But of course, the Zionists say, well, we don't believe in that, so they can think whatever they want, and we'll take their money and their support. So I'll give you one interesting example. I don't know if any of you saw this on video. When John Hagee, who was the head of Kufa, Christians United for Israel, which is the largest Christian Zionist organization in America, gives tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to Israel. And because of that, he was invited to give the invocation at the opening of the American embassy in Jerusalem. And so he's sitting there. He knows exactly where he is. He's in Jerusalem, and the front row, the reserved seats are all like the rabbinate. So these ultra-Orthodox Jews are sitting there. And Hagee starts talking about the embassy. Within 2 minutes, he starts talking about Jesus. And all of these ultra-Orthodox Jews are kind of looking at their shoes, right? Now, he knew what he was doing. He knew who was sitting there. But this is, in a certain sense, this is the Christian Zionism of that. I'm not saying throughout, but the Christian Zionism of John Hagee is a Christian Zionism that is really about the second coming of Christ. And he was unabashed about that. He didn't hide it. It was fascinating. He didn't have to talk about Jesus. He could have just talked about, Jerusalem or something like that. So I think that's one thing. I think that the idea of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, full stop, you also have to add that some Zionism is anti-Semitism, right? So that it goes both ways. And to say that that somebody, now I agree with you. I was at the campus protest at Harvard. I was at the campus protest at Columbia. I was at the campus protest at NYU. So I was at those places. And it's not to say that there wasn't anti-Semitism that emerged in those protests in terms of, comments that were made and so on and so forth. But I am against saying that the protests themselves were anti-Semitic. The protests themselves were about a horrific war. And you can say that things were said that shouldn't be said, that lines were crossed. But I think it's really erasing boundaries and distinctions when you say, as the ADL does, if I stand on a street corner and hold up a sign and say, stop the genocide in Gaza, somebody drives by, calls up the ADL and reports me, that's marked as an anti-Semitic incident. So when you think about the rise in anti-Semitic incidents like 500% or something like that, you have to realize those things are part of that calculus. And so it really kind of misconstrues what was happening. And just, if I can just, one more comment, I'll give just an example. I listened to a webinar of, campus Hillels are these kind of Jewish, do people know what campus Hillels are? They're kind of Jewish, places for Jews to congregate. They're not academic, they're social, places. So a Hillel rabbi of a very prominent university gave a webinar about the campus, anti-Semitism, Jews on campus, and things like that in September of this last term. 1,000 people on the webinar, donors, parents of students, and so on. He spoke in great detail about the campus protests. He spoke in great detail about anti-Semitism on campus, students feeling unsafe, all of the things that you would think he should do. And he did it brilliantly. Except after the webinar was over, I realized that throughout the 90 minutes, he never mentioned the word war. He never mentioned the word there was a war. Like the protests, if you knew nothing about these campus protests and you came in from walking the Appalachian Trail for 6 months and you listened to that webinar, you would say, oh, these are all just protests against the Jews. They were protesting a war. Now, what happens in those protests is closer to what you're talking about. But I think to say to somebody, whatever their background, white, Muslim, Christian, Arab, Jew, to say to somebody, you can't protest against the killing of children and the maiming of children, that's anti-Semitic. I don't think that really serves the purpose. I mean, that's not going to make a person that might have negative feelings about the Jews have less negative feelings about the Jews, right? In fact, sometimes it works just the opposite. So I think it's as you were saying, it's the idea of definitions. It's a very, very complicated story in terms of, and not an easy one, by the way. But it's a very complicated story in terms of this moment. That's why I really do think that October 7th is a real inflection point in terms of what kind of state Israel is going to choose to be, in terms of what kind of state it is, in terms of how did this happen, how did we come to this point. That, as I was saying to Avinoam a few minutes ago, it's now people are starting to reflect back on it. Like, what is the aftermath of all this? And what's the way forward in thinking through all of these complex issues? So thank you for the questions.
Thank you for the answers. Now, just a second. Here we go. Thank you for the answer. More questions. Yes, Avinoam, and then up there. Yeah. One mic up here, please. Yeah. And then yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated the clarity with which you brought out these sort of internal contradictions that arise and become unresolvable and prevent us from having conversations. I think there's another definition that is, to me, of vast both legal and political and ethical and conceptual import in this whole conversation. That's sort of the counter of all of this, and that's the definition of genocide, right? As it is being debated constantly as the violence in Gaza continues. Yeah. And I wonder how you think your triad, again, without asking you to adjudicate an issue that's currently in front of the International Criminal Court, but how you think your triad interacts with this other extremely acute issue of definition.
Right. No, it's a great question, and it's something that I know in the States is almost like you're either on team genocide or you're on team not genocide, right? And the use of that term has been very, very, very kind of fraught. I think less so over time, because I think a number of people. First of all, I think that the International Criminal Court came out about genocidal behavior, and like it's kind of softened it. And Omar Bartov came out and basically calling it genocide. And I don't like the term. First of all, it's a legal term, and I just feel like I don't know enough about the legalities of it. But the reason that I don't like the term is because I think it obfuscates, as if it's genocide, it's bad. And if it's not genocide, it's not so bad. I mean, something can be horrific and not genocide. I mean, I prefer the term sociocide, which there's a political scientist named Keith Doubt who wrote a book called Sociocide back in the early 2000s. And he basically defines sociocide as the intentional destruction of the intentional destruction of a social infrastructure. And in a certain sense, it's not about necessarily the eradication of a part or a whole of a people, but it's the destruction of a society. And I think from my perspective, it's very hard to look at Gaza and not see it as sociocide. It is the intentional, when you bomb water purifying plants, you're destroying the infrastructure of a society such that it can no longer function. Okay, so it's a little bit kind of technical and academic, but I have to really kind of remain kind of agnostic, because I seem to move closer and closer to recognizing that this is and things that are coming out of Israel now in terms of ethnic cleansing and taking all these people and putting them into one place in Rafah, like all of these different movements, that there's something that is getting very dangerously close to the legal definition of genocide. But again, it's such a team thing. Like if you say that word, half the people will stop listening, right? And so in a certain sense, you lose the potential to be able to make an argument because the word is so far. Interestingly, apartheid used to be like that 10 years ago in Israel. Nobody in Israel cares about apartheid anymore. I mean, they're not offended by it because it's such a plain reality that it's just, we don't really care. So I think that ethnic cleansing is something else that's coming down. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's the movement that we've tend to move closer to the term, as you described. It has to do with the changing reality on the ground. So I mean, it is getting worse and worse and worse, and it's so. But I think just one small remark to this, because in Germany it's also so contested, that I think as a legal term, I think it's very obvious that if you use it like tick boxes, then you say, yeah, okay, it fulfills more or less what's in the Genocide Convention. But as a term, it is so charged with meaning and with historical meaning that people shy away from it or instrumentalize it, etc. So I think it, as you said, it's much more important to really describe what is on the ground. And when I mentioned, and maybe some of you noticed, other elements of what happened in the 40s are what is happening now in Gaza. Yeah. Elements of genocide, let's put it like this. I saw more hands over there, and I would like to collect these two questions because we have to come to an end slowly. So first you, and then there was somebody on my left, which would be your right.
Yeah, thank you very much for the second time today. We saw each other in the seminar earlier. I have a kind of a different question on the term, on the subject of exceptionalism. So I think a lot of the nations, and especially if you listen to nationalist narratives, consider themselves very exceptional. Like we can look at almost every country and find some kind of self-defining narrative of exceptionalism, especially if you look at countries that maybe have some, I don't want to compare too easily because it's so charged, but if you listen to Armenian narratives, for example, or if you listen to Ethiopian narratives where it's very much about like the uniqueness of the religiously charged nation and so on. So why is this exceptionalism so supercharged? Like why is this one so strong? Why does it have such a strong effect? And then maybe a second leg of this question to Frau Schüler-Springorum. How do you see Germany related to this? Because I feel like Germany tries to prove that we learned from the past, and this is kind of becoming our exceptionalism with the raison d'etat and like all of these things. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit, both of you, on exceptionalism. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's take the second one. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. As a person from America as well, and who has firsthand experience within the American Jewish community, I was just wanted your opinion on how much of the silence from the American Jewish community is, well, self-protection from the fear of being too left or too Zionist, not Zionist enough, too loud, or the worst sin of all, being considered too American or not Israeli enough.
Right. Right. Okay. Let me start with the first, if I can, the exceptionalism question quickly. It's a great question, and you're right. You can go through the histories of many nations who develop a certain kind of exceptionalist narrative about themselves. For the most part, and this goes to Winthrop's City on the Hill, the exceptionalism is something positive. And either in the American case, liberal democracy or freedom of religion, or in other cases, other kinds of national myths. And I think the danger in the Israeli case is it's a negative exceptionalism. It's the exceptionalism that's built on the foundation that the world hates us. And that therefore we always have to see ourselves as victims. And that's a kind of exceptionalism that you don't see in other places in the same way. I remember listening to, it might have been one of the Israeli parliamentarians talking about, I don't know, the justification of the war in Gaza, and some newscaster asked him, well, can the whole world be wrong? And he said, yes, the whole world is wrong. And it's a very common response from within the Israeli context. So I think it's not the exceptionalism itself, it's the fact that it's founded on something negative that makes it problematic, at least for me. On the silence question, that's also a great question. I think the silence is that increasingly the American Jewish community writ large, and I'm speaking about let me put it this way. In the 1970s, there developed what became known in American Jewry as the Zionist consensus. That is, after 1967, the Six-Day War, American Jews were Zionists. And we talked about that actually earlier today, right? And what I think happened in October 7th and the war is that the Zionist consensus in America has collapsed. It hasn't ended, but it's collapsed. And I think why I'm using this to respond is that I think that for many, what we call liberal Zionists, which is really what the consensus is, they look at this war in Gaza and they don't know what to think. They don't know what to say. They know that they can't justify it, but yet not justifying it puts them on the wrong side, right? You either justify the war or you're anti-Israel. And so in a certain sense, it makes it impossible for them to respond. So you have all of these very nuanced yes, but kind of responses, right? The war is justified, but the loss of civilian life, that increasingly becomes a harder and harder argument to make. So in a certain sense, the campus protests were was like the saving grace, because then they just turned to the campus protests and no one was talking about Gaza anymore, even though the campus protests were about Gaza. So I think that that's part of what we're seeing, that the Jews whose identity as Zionists in America has become fused with their identity as Jews, and that's actually very common, where in a recent book, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove wrote, I can no longer separate my Jewish identity from Israel, so that if somebody is critical of Israel, it's as if they're critical of them, personally. And how do they respond to the catastrophe of what's happening in Gaza? I don't think that they really have a response, and I think that that's part of the silence.
Okay, so I will just briefly try to answer your question. I think there is something like a German exceptionalism in that related to how we deal with our past. But I think first of all, it's very important to realize that that's a recent development. Like for the first 50 years after the war, the situation was quite different. I mean, even still in the 80s, the German government tried to do everything to prevent Germany being mentioned, on top front in the US Holocaust Museum. I mean, they were very much against this project, and if you do it, try not to talk about Germany like in a negative way so much. So it was really a diplomatic effort. So this changes after unification, and it also has like political diplomatic reasons, of course, and then and also some generational changes. I don't want to go into detail, but I always thought that, in a way, I mean, then this image of being like the world champion and getting, how do you say, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with your past, in order to make this plausible or being very cynical now, plausible or attractive to the political and cultural elites, especially the political elites who had to pay for it, was that we have been the worst of the worst, like the evil embodiment of evil, and nobody did anything worse than we did. So I think there is something to it. And I think this is also why it is so very, very hard, all these discussions that we are having in this country, to just say, hey, let's listen to different stories. We don't have to compare them, we don't have to put them into hierarchy, but let's maybe listen to the stories of other genocides or to the victims of other genocides. Maybe not even German genocide, but not, maybe just, or to slavery histories, etc., etc. So I think this apprehension to expose yourself to it really has something to do with this exceptionalism. And it's, I think, in my eyes, and since I'm coming from originally also from the all the concentration camp memorial sites and memorial politics, I find it really hard, I must say, I feel this apprehension very much there as well. It isn't, and not only in the elite and the elderly, but really among younger people who work in Holocaust remembrance. It's that, who kind of cling to it as something German and special. And I think, in a way, it's sad because it prevents you from, like, enlightenment in a way on our reality and on our history. So, having said that, I think we are almost perfectly on time, only 2 minutes over. You want to say, some famous last words, because it's also the last session of the whole series?
Darf für das Wintersemester ankündigen, dass die Mosse-Lecture auch wieder versuchen wird, ihr Interesse zu finden mit dem Thema Coup d'État, Staatsstreiche also im Winter. Und ich wünsche Ihnen noch einen schönen Abend. Nice evening. Thank you.